for inviting MMDR to this really important conversation. Some of it does really get heavy, and I just want to let you all know to be gentle with yourselves and to really just to let you know that it might be some heavy content that we talk about here. If you need to step away or if you need to put it on mute, that's totally fine. I won't be offended, but I wanted to let you know that there will be some heavy information that I'll be discussing here. So with that, and again, I wanted to apologize again for being late, but it was really great hearing some of your introductions and hearing and seeing some familiar names here, and those who are really important to the work when it comes to the missing and murdered crisis, as well as the domestic and sexual violence issues. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we can get started. So I'm going to stop my video just so that you can see this. Okay. So as I mentioned before, I am the project manager for the Missing and Murdered Diné relatives. Whoops, what is this doing? Oh, there we go. And I just kind of wanted to go over the history of how we had kind of come to be. So I think several people are very familiar with the 2016 tragic loss of Ashley and Mike in the Shiprock area. And at that time, there was no task force, there was no group that was out there that were addressing the areas of sexual and domestic violence. During that time, I was working with the legislative branch as the policy analyst for the Navajo Nation Sexual Assault Prevention Subcommittee. But even before that took place, Council Delegate Amber Crotty sponsored legislation to establish the Sexual Assault Prevention Subcommittee Task Force. That being established under the 23rd Navajo Nation Council allowed our leaders to really start taking a look at what's going on out there. With the feedback that we were receiving from the public, folks who were just incredibly concerned about the Navajo Nation's lack of response to these issues, definitely led to the formulation of the task force. And this has to be reestablished with every new administration. So thankfully, this was reestablished last year in June 2019. And Kelsey, if anyone has any questions, just let me know. I can't see the chat box, so I just want to put that out there. So we had another work group that was addressing sexual violence on the Navajo Nation, and we were called the Sexual Violence Prevention Working Group. As we started to really look at these different intersections of sexual and domestic violence, we realized that it had a lot to do with the missing and murdered crisis on Navajo. We were receiving numbers as well as community groups who were reaching out to us to be very mindful and to pay attention to this issue that was taking place. And so we started to redirect some of our energy to look at this in a very holistic way. And that's how the MMDR team was created. So we are comprised of subject matter experts in data, epidemiology, victim advocacy, human rights, policy development, and history. As you can see the list there, those are some of our partners that work with us, whether it's in a direct capacity or if it's in a support capacity where they're able to sponsor different areas of parts of our work. We definitely consider them partners. So taking this multidisciplinary approach, we felt like was really beneficial because there's just so many things taking place when it comes to the missing and murdered crisis. There's different intersections such as drug and alcohol dependency, housing insecurity, of course, sexual and domestic violence, suicide, suicidal ideations, violence, community violence in communities. And we felt like if we were going to be intentional about the work that we're doing, we have to enlist people and take a very multifaceted approach of how we wanted to address this crisis on Navajo. So in March 2019, that's when we were officially established, and we started to look for partnerships throughout the Navajo Nation. The original intent of our team was to develop a data institute. And with that, we wanted to kind of break down those silos that were taking place in the Navajo Nation. You had IHS collecting their own data. You had law enforcement collecting their own data. You had social services collecting their own data, and so on and so forth. But none of those programs or data interface with one another. So that's telling these different threads of the story. And we felt like it was really important to understand that. And we felt like if there was a way that we were able to unify that information, it would put Navajo Nation in a really good place to start addressing some of these issues in a very holistic way. After we created those partnerships, we were assembled, we were ready to go. We started to brainstorm and really think about, other than the Data Institute, how do we get what we need from the community and make sure that their voices are at the table? A lot of the work that guides us has a lot to do with working with families who've been affected by the missing and murdered crisis, as well as community members who have been affected in one way or another. I think if many of us were to reflect on our own families, I'm sure there's a good majority of us who know someone who's still missing or who has a relative who has lost their life to violence. So that was one way we felt like we needed to take that approach. So at that time, we started to think about and plan for our community forums. So this is just kind of a quick timeline of kind of how fast we mobilized and organized and started looking at how we could get our community together to get their input. So before I go into more of that information, I wanted to share some data information with you all. So from 2010 to 2016, the Navajo Nation Department of Public Safety received an average of over 200,000 emergency calls annually. And half of those calls involved some form of violence, whether that was sexual violence, domestic violence, assault, battery. That made up half of the calls from that time frame. So right now, the Navajo Nation Police Department has about 200 police officers and 30 criminal investigators. And I want to update you on that number. That number has actually decreased. So we have about, I believe, 150 police officers and about a little over 20 criminal investigators right now who are covering approximately 18 million acres of Navajo land. And just to put that in a bit more perspective, the Navajo Nation is 27,000 square miles. And of course, you know, we land in Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. So when we started to filter out what that coverage really looked like on the Navajo Nation, it's less than one officer for every 1,000 citizens, as compared to the national average, where folks in major metropolitan areas or even county areas would have at least 16 to 24 police officers for every 1,000 citizens. So that kind of illustrates a very big challenge when it comes to needing law enforcement to respond to whether that's domestic violence or reporting folks who may have gone missing, things like that. So Navajo Nation responds to about 40, I want to say under 40 homicides per year. We did take a look at the UCR data, and when they reported for 2018 and 2019, and we were able to average it out, it's in a good way. It has decreased to about, I want to say 23 to 25 homicides per year. And I do apologize that this isn't updated. I don't have my regular laptop that I always have with me, so I had to pull this from our shared drive. Right now, murder on the Navajo Nation is 4 times the national average on a population per capita. So that means that we are comparable to crimes in major US cities. For instance, we've been compared to Chicago and we've been compared to Detroit, which, as you know, those are some of the areas with the highest number of violent crimes that are taking place. So the data that I shared before, this is data that we received from the Navajo Nation law enforcement, as well as the FBI UCR reports. And we felt like, okay, this is telling a good part of what's going on, but we feel like it was not capturing what people were really experiencing at the community level. So we partnered with a couple of community groups, one of those being the Navajo Nation Missing Persons Updates, which is an amazing group who have volunteer advocates that work with families who have missing loved ones. We also partnered with Sovereign Bodies Institute, who were the first organization to create the first MMIW database in the United States. So when we were able to kind of draw out those numbers with our partners, this is what data we were able to pull from that. Now, this number fluctuates, the 164, because it's all dependent on when cases open and when cases close. Some weeks it's as high as over 170. When cases close, sometimes it can be under 160. So we try to average it as best we can. So just a note in mind that this number does fluctuate. So when we also look at the gender of those who were missing, roughly 30% of our female relatives are missing and 70% are male. And we always get asked why that differs from the national conversation where in MMIW, the majority of our missing women nationally are female. And, you know, that's a question that we're still trying to answer ourselves. But we can report is that 38% of those cases of the missing persons and 62% of those cases are missing persons and 62% are murder cases. And what I mean by that is the spectrum reverses there, where the majority of violent crimes and perpetrations that are happening against our Navajo women are being perpetrated by our male relatives. So in one aspect, many of our missing relatives are male, but on the other side of that spectrum, they are generally the perpetrators of violence on the Navajo Nation. So of those murder cases, 41% occurred on the Navajo Nation, 10% occurred in the rural off-reservation areas, and 49% occurred in the urban communities. The average age of a person who goes missing is about 31 years old. 22% of the cases reported involved young girls under the age of 18. And to kind of speak to this point, when we were kind of looking at the information of our young girls who are being targeted, this definitely does intersect with human trafficking. Our young girls are targeted online by predators. There's been some cases on Navajo which did not get a lot of attention, where young girls were lured and taken and basically kidnapped from their home areas. One case in particular happened out of Kayenta, and where a young girl was groomed online in Kayenta, and this individual picked her up and promised her a life of like marriage. She thought she was in love, and this person ended up taking them up north into the North Dakota area, where a lot of Native American girls were being trafficked. The FBI was able to do a sting in that area, and thankfully she was recovered and returned back with her family. Although that doesn't happen all too often, I just want to put it out there that this does directly relate to human trafficking and that a lot of our young girls are targeted. So 32% of those cases involve some form of domestic violence, and 4% involved sexual assault. In talking with some of the victim advocates and the shelters out there on the Navajo Nation, they report to our group that women who frequented their shelters or they provided services to these women at those shelters lost their lives to violence. And a lot of it was because they were former victims of domestic violence. So I know we just got out of the Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but I wanted to put that out there. We always get the question about how does domestic violence relate to the missing and murdered crisis? And it definitely correlates with those high risk factors of our relatives who are experiencing domestic violence, raises their chances of also being murdered. Although there is little to no data reported regarding the LGBTQI and Two-Spirit and unsheltered relatives, we are continuing to monitor and collect that information on the Navajo Nation and the surrounding border towns. I also wanted to note that during COVID-19, there were a lot of things that really exacerbated the issues when it came to the missing issue. We had a stark increase in missing persons during COVID. And because of some of those restrictions like the curfew, as well as just trying to shelter in place safely, as well as to protect our relatives, it made it additionally harder for folks to go out there and look for their family members. And I'll touch more on that when I get to that point in the presentation. So when we talk about the missing and murdered crisis, one thing that we want to also keep in mind is how intergenerational trauma, colonization, settler colonialism play an active role in a lot of these systemic issues, as well as community issues where our family members go missing or murdered. The lack of resources that we have on reservations to ensure the safety of Navajo women, combined with those socioeconomic challenges, really perpetuate a systemic culture of violence within Navajo families and communities. Although we acknowledge that the majority of our victims are female and are perpetrated by males, we have to also include our male relatives that also go missing or murdered. We feel like it's really important that we take a holistic and inclusive approach, and to also add to the conversation and to make sure that they're a part of the conversation are our LGBTQ, Two-Spirit, Naabik'íyáti, Dilba relatives who are also going missing or who are also going trafficked, who are being trafficked. So because of these historical happenings that have taken place and have entrenched our system, where we've had to adapt in like less than 100 years to these colonial frameworks, it really put our communities at a disadvantage, because things like this were not existent back then. Domestic violence, sexual violence, we had our own ways of justice historically. Families had ways of protecting one another. And so when like the police state was introduced, that really created this culture of dependency to really have to adapt to that. And that's a whole other subject, but this is also like one of those difficult conversations of creating that community conversation of how do we get our relatives to work with law enforcement when there's a huge distrust of law enforcement, when harm was caused by law enforcement to our relatives, when messaging coming from law enforcement doesn't line up to what we're always told to do. For instance, we had a conversation with an FBI agent last year, and we were asking, what do we need to do to protect ourselves? Like, what can FBI do? What can our law enforcement do? And this FBI agent was just blunt and said, get a gun. I don't know what your response time is going to be, but at this point, if you really have to protect yourself, get a gun. So if that's the messaging that we're receiving, we have to really start looking at how we want to protect our communities, and also how we want to start fostering that conversation to develop some of those community solutions. So I wanted to share some cases that I wanted to highlight these cases. I think they're really important to this conversation, but also to kind of let folks know what's really taking place out there. So in July 2017, Kaczynski Ariel Begay, a 26-year-old mother who resided in the southeastern edge of the Navajo Nation, was picked up from her residence by her boyfriend and never came back home. There were efforts made by law enforcement and a search ensued. Sadly, some of her remains were found in October, several months later, in the Quirino Canyon in Arizona. And that case remains unsolved today. We do work with Ariel's family, specifically her sister, Valia Cisco. And going back to the conversation of law enforcement, a lot of the information that the family had would definitely point to the boyfriend as the perpetrator. And this is kind of where that catch-22 happens, is if the FBI and law enforcement don't have like concrete evidence to arrest this person, they basically go free. But the family were able to keep record, especially like memory record of the times that he had beaten Ariel, the times that he had perpetrated this against Ariel, and that it was constantly something where Ariel was always in fear for her life. That's the kind of information that our group wants to collect and also advocate. And how do we make those connections so that these families can feel supported, but also that we get that attention from law enforcement that these stories are real, that it's happening at the community level, and this is evidence that they really need to take like a hard look at. So outside of the Navajo Nation borders, in December 2018, 26-year-old Amanda Dakota Webster, who was a mother of 3, was murdered in Florence, Kentucky. At that time, she was traveling for work and utilized her out-of-state income to support her family back on the Navajo Nation. And it wasn't just to support the family of her children, but it was also to support her family, her extended relatives. And I think that's really common for us as Navajos, where we have to travel outside of our 4 sacred mountains to really sustain some of the lifeways of our family on Navajo. During that time, 32-year-old Jesse James had confessed to brutally stabbing Webster to death, and they had no prior interactions with one another. Not quite sure what the nature of the conversation was between those two, but he was arrested, and right now the case is ongoing. Another area that is really important to highlight is also the violence that happens against our transgender relatives. 3 trans Navajo women were beaten to death in Albuquerque, and right there you can see their names listed: 23-year-old Vera Shea Hosky, 32-year-old Kelly Watson, and 42-year-old Cato Terry Benally. The manner of how they were murdered were very, very similar. I think this would point to evidence that this population definitely are being targeted. And in February 2018, Cato Benally's murder was found and indicted on murder charges and was classified as a hate crime. In 2019, the perpetrator was convicted and sentenced to 16 years in prison for the murder of Benally. And the last case, and this one really, like, I think kind of is really tough to talk about, because this was a grandmother who was an amazing person, who was not only a mother of 3, but also had grandchildren, and was murdered in November 30th, 2015. At that time, there was a land dispute between her family and a perpetrator by the name of Timothy Lee Smith. It was so, just the nature of the crime was incredibly, oh gosh, this is always a hard one for me. Just the nature of it was just incredibly disturbing. And we realized that violence is not just something that takes place and is happening to our young women, but this is happening to our women of all different age groups. And Lee was later indicted by the federal grand jury and was charged for first-degree murder, and was sentenced to at least 20 years in federal prison. So yeah, that one, that's always a tough case. And this is like one of the ones that, like, I have to sit down and just really take a step back. So gathering all that data information, gathering the community data information, talking with the families of these folks that are examples, the 4 examples that I just provided, we realized that we also needed to hear from the community. And the objective initially, as I mentioned before, was to create a data institute. We realized that the missing and murdered crisis in Navajo land is not an epidemic. This is something that we can recognize as an issue that has been ongoing, with historical roots that date back to the initial colonization of the American Southwest. If we look at history, even at the time of the Navajo Long Walk, we had relatives who were kidnapped, who were sold into slavery, who were sex trafficked throughout these different colonial networks, as well as even possibly through other tribal communities. So this isn't an issue that we try to stay away from using the word epidemic, because this is something that's been taking place for hundreds of years. So I just want to put that out there and make sure that we're very mindful of how we think about the missing and murdered crisis in that respect. So in June 2019, we held our first forum in Shiprock, New Mexico. And then from there at NAU and Flagstaff, Gallup, and Tuba City. We had initially this year had planned for a forum in Utah, but with the pandemic, where the first wave had hit at that time, we decided it was important for us to be safe and to allow folks to really kind of adjust to the pandemic. And we took a break at that point. From those community forums, we had some really great conversations that came from the communities, and through their recommendations, we realized that we had to take a multifaceted approach. We consolidated all of the comments that were made. We consolidated the electronic comments and emails that we received, and it turned into 5 different areas. The first team that we have is the MMDR Data Institute team. And these folks are dedicated to finding ways of how we can find sustainable funding, as well as establishing the Data Institute and building that Data Institute out. Like, what are those data indicators? Where is it going to be housed? And how would this be approached? Team 2 is sustainability. We realize that this is going to be an ongoing project for several years. So we have to look at ways of how we're going to sustain this. And this doesn't always mean monetary. When it comes to community organizing, money does help, but also just having a group of compassionate and passionate individuals come to the table to really carry this work in a very good way. We utilize our different networks. We have sister organizations that are able to help us when we need, whether that's like technical assistance or amplifying a message or looking for grants, that sort of thing. Our third team right now is in the process of establishing MMDR as a nonprofit. This is something where we felt like if we're going to get access to wraparound services, if we're going to get access to support for our families, that we had to really establish our roots to gain access to whether that's grants or foundations or any type of those areas. We really had to also organize in that way. Team 4 is our community mobilization group, and they are phenomenal. They're our social media team. There are folks who are working on our community toolkit, which I'll get to here in a little bit. And also just developing some of that prevention and post-vention content. Once we are established as a nonprofit, we're able to put those pieces together and really start to mobilize in a bigger way. Team 5, through the leadership of Council Delegate Amber Crotty, advocates for these issues at the state, tribal, and federal level. We have drafted position statements, talking points for Navajo leadership to convey our message out there at a broader level. Recently, Delegate Crotty provided testimony at the OVW consultation, the Office of Violence Against Women, which was last week, the Operation Lady Justice consultation, which was in July, and in December 2018, Delegate Crotty was invited to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs to also provide testimony during their MMIW hearing. So through these different channels and networks, we wanted to make sure that we were reaching as many areas as possible. And it really helps when you have a team that is really dynamic and they're experts in these different areas. But what really pushes us is when we interface with the community, when we talk with the families, when we hear what it is that they want. These areas are tailored. So this isn't something that we feel like should be rigid, but we like to move in a very fluid way where things change, especially like when COVID happened. So a little bit about the Data Institute. When we compared the data information that I had presented on earlier, we realized that there was a huge contrast between what was really taking place. We also wanted to look at which Navajo programs were underfunded and how the data information did not interface across the board on the nation. So our team, which our partners, Northern Arizona University and Diné College, are creating that framework right now. Again, what are those indicators? How are we going to collect data? Where is it going to be housed? And what's the best way to manage that? And then how do we bring Navajo Nation as a whole into that conversation? So this Data Institute would also provide the nation to track cases, to collect data, and also to develop informed policies to bring our Diné relatives home. We realized that, for instance, the human trafficking law proved very successful when that was passed in 2017. And some of those child sex abuse cases actually transitioned to trafficking cases. And those allowed intervention at the federal level for those cases to really be taken seriously and to be investigated at a more thorough level. So the other major reason why we'd like to establish this Data Institute is that it would be another step towards self-determination. We feel like if we can have control over our information and our own data, we would be able to kind of not always depend on state and federal data collection, because there's only so much that they're able to capture, but we're also able to kind of fill in those gaps where data was not collected before. So after having those community forums, a huge part of that feedback from our community members had said, great, you all want to collect data, you all want to take these, a policy approach, that's great, but what are you doing for us directly? Like, I've got someone who's missing, I don't know what to do when that happens, I don't know what that process is, or I don't trust working with law enforcement. So we took a step back and we really thought about how we needed to digest that information and really help our community at that level. So we started to develop a missing persons community toolkit. In August 2019, we started that discussion with the Navajo Department of Public Safety and Criminal Investigations. At this point, and I want to be very transparent, we have not heard from Navajo Public Safety about how they would support that. It was an idea that we pitched to them, saying that our families need help, but also you have a community group at your disposal who are willing to create that framework, who are willing to help train across the board how folks can utilize this toolkit. But also this would alleviate a lot of that stress that law enforcement have, especially with them being underfunded and not being fully staffed. We felt this was one way we could offer that lift. When we didn't receive a response from public safety, we just went ahead and started to create it on our own. So what this toolkit includes is the missing persons reporting process, steps for gathering information. So there would be like a communications log. If someone goes missing at so-and-so time, or you get phone calls or tips or any kind of information, folks will have this log to keep track of everything that comes in. The second part to that toolkit is also going to be how to mobilize. How do you get your missing persons flyers out there? How do you use social media as a platform to amplify that message? And then if it's a ground search, how do you set up a command post, a community command post where you can appoint those coordinators and that there's a roadmap for our community members to follow. There's also a part in there with how to work with law enforcement, and also things to be aware of like what would constitute for an Amber Alert, what would constitute, like a Silver Alert, things like that we want to make folks aware of. And it's a lot of information, but we want to make sure that it's comprehensive and that we answer as many questions for folks who are experiencing this. Will have that at their disposal. Of course, myself, as well as our sister organization, Navajo Nation Missing Persons Updates, are trained as victim advocates. So we're able to also assist families in gaining access to services, whether that's crimes victims compensation, whether that's, how do you keep record of conversations with law enforcement. And then also at that level, Delegate Crotty utilizes her leadership position to kind of place pressure on some of those agencies when it's really like an emergency. So yeah, that's our toolkit. I know that was a lot of information and I wanted to do a really quick time check. It's about 12:51. We are online. We do have a website at NavajoMMDR.com. Right now, we are a grassroots community group, and we are not officially a 501c3 just yet, but we do accept donations on our website, and a lot of that goes to our advocates, but mostly we support other search efforts. So for instance, CC Finona's family continues the search for Cecilia in the Farmington area. We funnel those donations to the family for their search efforts. We were able to funnel some funds to the Navajo Nation Missing Persons to buy a drone, so they're able to get a broader look at the landscape when searching for folks who might be out there in the tough terrain. So there's just different areas where we try to make sure that we utilize and share those resources for folks who really need it. And with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. If there are any questions, or I'd be happy to answer them.